Hi everyone. So this video is about the first era of federalism, and you can see some prior videos for an introduction to federalism and the progression of federalism. So let's jump into it. So when the Constitution was created, the issue was how to marry the state governments together with the federal governments in a way that would be acceptable to all parties involved. And even as the ink was still glistening on the Constitution, arguments about how to interpret it arose. So if you think constitutional arguments now are surprising, even the founders who wrote the document had their disagreements about how it should be interpreted. And so if anybody has ever been married is watching this will know that the main thing married couples fight about is money. And that's the same situation that happens here with the first era of federalism. So there was this idea of a national bank. Thomas Jefferson in one corner, Alexander Hamilton in another corner, and they butted heads over basically everything. But in this particular situation, Hamilton had a concept of a national bank. He wanted to overcome the flaws of the Articles of Confederation, which did not allow for national commerce, and build up a national economy. The United States at that time was extremely poor. We were also a very, very poor trading partner. That meant that we could not trade equitably with other nations because we didn't have a national economy. And so the people were living in poverty. Hamilton thought we can build up the economic situation, the financial situation of the public if we are able to band together. At the time, under the Articles, each of the 13 states would negotiate with other countries if they wanted to trade. And the result of that was kind of like what would happen if a small town were to negotiate with an entire country. Obviously, the entire country is going to have the upper hand, and they're going to be able to get the better deal. And so, for example, South Carolina trying to trade with France, France recognized that South Carolina was a small area with little power. And so they would say, well, okay, you have peaches and you have peanuts, but you know what? So does Georgia. So does North Carolina. And France would go to Georgia and say, hey, South Carolina's selling for this. Can you do me better? And so Georgia would undercut, and then North Carolina would undercut. So the states were basically in a bidding war, continually undercutting one another, which helped no one and hurt all of the states. And so Hamilton's concept of a national bank was one that would build up the economy and everyone would benefit. So instead of 13 separate states, as we'd had under the Articles, you'd have one nation trading. Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, didn't like that at all. He thought that the idea of implied powers, which is where Hamilton was getting his argument, should not be as powerful as Hamilton thought that they should be. And so you have almost immediately a debate over implied powers versus enumerated powers. Okay, so a bank was not enumerated in the Constitution, but Hamilton successfully argued that a national bank was an implied power of Congress. They could regulate money, and they also could use the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, which gives Congress the authority to deal with international trade. And so Jefferson did not win that argument. A national bank was established, and that lasted for 20 years. Its charter lapsed in 1812. We were busy fighting a war. We didn't focus on it for a while. In 1816, a second Bank of the United States was established. Well, by that point, there was more sentiment in favor of not having a national bank in particular areas that were doing quite well. Ironically, the sentiment came because the national bank had done its job. It had helped shore up the economies and the finances of the public and businesses. But now the public did not want that kind of competition. Before, it was seen as a way of creating financial security, and now it was seen as a competitor for state banks. Okay, and so the Supreme Court case McCulloch v. Maryland came about as a result of this. All right, so Edwin McCulloch was the head cashier, like the CEO, of the Second Bank of the United States in the state of Maryland. Okay, so he was the head honcho there. The state of Maryland recognized we have an idea, or they recognized they have a possibility if they were going to drive the Bank of the United States out of business in Maryland, all they would have to do is just tax it at 100%. The business cannot survive at that. McCulloch, as the representative of the Second Bank of the United States, refused to pay the tax to the state of Maryland, and so it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, for the first time, was to determine how is federalism going to be implemented. Is the state going to be on top, or are the states going to be on top, or is the federal government going to be on top? And so for the first time, they set the precedent that if there is a federal law and a state law, you have to follow the federal law. And that has been the precedent since that time period. That has remained unchanged. And so states must be subservient to the federal government. Who's going to be most powerful was really the issue at hand there. So this was a big victory for both federal dominance, that the states could not tax a sovereign entity of the national government, and also of implied powers that they did exist and that they could be utilized to do such things as establish a national bank. This was further supported just 5 years later by a second Supreme Court case called Gibbons v. Ogden, and Gibbons v. Ogden was a case about ferry boat monopolies. The state of New York decided to issue a monopoly to one ferry boat company, and so that was the only way you could get around if you were going between New York and New Jersey. And that ferry boat monopoly caused hardship for the public because if a company has a monopoly, that means they own all the options and they can charge whatever they like. And people had to go between New York and New Jersey because they work in New York, they live in New Jersey. And so tickets one day were $2, and then at the end of the day, they were $600. Whoa. And so that goes to the Supreme Court, and it's decided that the state cannot provide a monopoly for private businesses and prevent the federal government from interfering. So the federal government did have that authority in the Gibbons case. But not everybody was a fan of this concept of strong federal dominance. And so there were objections from people who were states' rights champions. Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina, local guy, was a real firebrand for states' rights, and he created something called the Doctrine of Nullification. And that's a mouthful. You know, what is it politically? Well, politically, it was just a political tool, okay? It was not legislation. It was not a Supreme Court decision. It was just something used for political leverage. He was a very powerful senator, and he used it several times in the United States Senate in order to get his way. In a nutshell, the Doctrine of Nullification stated that if a state did not like a federal law, it did not have to abide by that federal law. Well, that's nothing like what the Supreme Court has, had been determining for the last 30 years, right? Okay, so obviously there's going to be some conflict over that. The Doctrine of Nullification was invoked in 1832. The Civil War almost broke out on the floor of the Senate in 1832. It got to the point where all the senators, they were all pointing guns at one another. And now you're not allowed to have guns on the floor of the Senate unless you are the sergeant at arms, and he's got that for security. But tempers flew, and Senator John Calhoun, he invoked the doctrine on a piece of legislation that had been introduced by northern states, and it was designed to really hurt southern states, hurt their economy. And so he invoked the doctrine of nullification were it to pass, and the northern states had the numbers to pass that legislation at that time. And so there was some real concern that the southern states were going to secede. And the northern states recognized when he invoked the doctrine, they were like, whoa, guys, okay. I mean, they say they're going to secede all the time, but this time they might mean it. And so the northern states amended the tariff so that it was not so negatively impactful on the southern states. And Senator Calhoun backed off, rescinded the doctrine of nullification for that particular moment. And the Union was, at the time, not plunged into civil war. The Civil War, of course, eventually did occur. The doctrine of nullification continued, by the way, for over 100 years in terms of being used as political leverage. If you're familiar with the civil rights movement, It was used by a lot of white leaders to prevent integration from occurring. Okay, so if you haven't watched Forrest Gump, watch Forrest Gump. But there's a bit that's from that is dealing with the civil rights movement, the integration of the University of Alabama. And President JFK, President Kennedy, sent troops to integrate forcibly the, without violence, but require the integration of the University of Alabama. And the governor of Alabama was standing in the doorway of the classroom that the students were trying to enter. And so he, as he stood in that doorway, invoked the doctrine of nullification from Senator Calhoun. That's 130 years later. So it had a lot of political usage up to the Civil War and then for a long time after. So meanwhile, we've got some conflict in terms of the balance of power in Congress. So now when we think about the balance of power in Congress, you think about, is it controlled by Democrats? Is it controlled by Republicans? Back then, the conflict was between northern states and southern states. And westward expansion was causing some challenges to that conflict because every time we added a new state, then you would get a change in the balance of power in Congress. Now, when we have elections, we have that change in power. But westward expansion was causing some real difficulties there. You could be in power one day and out of power the next day. And so there were certain pieces of legislation put into place to manage that, the most famous being the Missouri Compromise, which was passed in 1820. And so the Missouri Compromise basically drew the Mason-Dixon line, dividing the country in half and sticking Missouri in the bottom, even though it's above it. And the ruling was that that states that would enter in north of the line would be free states. States that would enter south of the line would be states where slavery was practiced. Okay, and so that really helped alleviate the challenges of westward expansion. However, it also meant that people who were held in slavery in northern states were technically free. Now, unfortunately, for people held in slavery, they did not know that. This is not something that people who owned slaves were going around telling people held in slavery, oh, hey, you're free now. And it wasn't until 37 years later that a Supreme Court case came about challenging that. Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857. Now, Dred Scott was a clever man. He was held in slavery, and he also was literate, which was very rare. It was extremely unusual because it was illegal for someone to be held in slavery to be exposed to literacy of any kind. But he was quite intelligent, and he was permitted to read the Bible at night. He taught himself how to read in the study in the house after he had finished his work in the great house on the plantation. And he looked around. He finished the Bible, and he looked around. And he was like, "I see some law books." He was a smart man. And so he and an abolitionist named Sanford concocted a plan to challenge the Missouri Compromise. So Dred Scott learned about the Missouri Compromise and recognized if Sanford purchased him, took him to a free state, then he could apply for his freedom under the Missouri Compromise. And so they did just that. This was an orchestrated Supreme Court case. Most of the most landmark court cases are orchestrated. Unfortunately for Dred Scott, he had the most negative impact that he could possibly imagine. The outcome of the Dred Scott case was to invalidate the Missouri Compromise. So basically he lost. He did not get his freedom. Okay. He also had hoped to set the precedent that everybody taken to a free state, if they were held in slavery, would be free under the Missouri Compromise. But the Supreme Court was full of white supremacists, stacked full, and they overturned the Missouri Compromise. Dred Scott was already ill and unfortunately died before the Civil War, so he did not know that slavery eventually was overturned. So the Civil War marks the end of the first era of federalism, and 1865 begins the second era of federalism.